that has been my growth experience in Toastmasters. I restarted at Toastmasters in 2015. Prior to that, I'd been through 6 speeches at a corporate club about a decade earlier. My restart, my second journey started when an executive at IBM where I worked pulled me aside after a client meeting where I'd given a presentation. And he said, "Do you know how many times you said the word during that discussion?" And my first thought was, well, maybe 2 or 3, but an executive doesn't pull you aside to tell you you said 2 or 3 times. He said it was a lot. And at that point, I decided to go back to Toastmasters. My goal was to learn to stop saying while I spoke. And I really wanted to improve my speech organization so I could present facts in a more understandable and compelling way. I really approached it from an analytical standpoint. Here are some hard skills. I work to acquire them, and off I go. But it turns out a speech is more than just a series of facts. It's really a connection with the audience. I could give you a set of facts. I could say, Terry won the race. Dora threw the rock. Sean scored the goal. Rita saved the day. Mike gave the speech. Emily brought the eggs. Greg lost the ring. Quinn rang the bell. Nina sat under a tree. And Peter changed the approach. Those statements are all true. They are all important. And I want you all to remember them. Now, what do you aim to achieve in a speech? One quick couple of quick minutes and offer what you're trying to do with your speeches. Marilee says, just the facts, information, and engage the audience. Yes, audience engagement is very important. What else are you trying to accomplish in a speech? Education. Thank you, Gordon. That's a good one. And that's part of what I'm trying to accomplish today. Tell a story with a message. Thank you, Joyce. Excellent segue into the rest of the discussion. Inspire, educate, and motivate. And interestingly enough, none of those things necessarily have to do with a whole bunch of facts, but the facts do get woven in. This afternoon's workshop, get my point across and have people take action for work issues. Excellent, Jim. Getting people to take action is an important one. Getting people to laugh. Thank you, Vladimira. When people are laughing and having fun, they probably learn more, listen better, and are much more engaged. This afternoon's workshop is, as Vladimir mentioned, part of a series of 5. It looks like 6, but it's actually only 5. The purpose was section talked about defining your purpose, your general purpose, whether that's to inform or persuade, entertain or inspire, and a specific purpose, which is what is it you're trying to do in one sentence. And in that module, we talk about making sure it's from the audience's perspective, what's in it for the audience, and to the point about getting people to take action. You want to invoke change. You want to make people feel or act a certain way. Opening and closing. Opening a speech, you want to create a compelling opening to capture the audience's attention. Do it quickly, and it should be related to your purpose. Works even better if you start with stories or a bold statement, or vary your vocal variety or use gestures that relate to your words so that people see almost a multimedia effect. At the end of the speech, you probably want to bookend it by, and this is why that module has opening and closing together. You bookend it by giving the audience a reference back to your opening somehow so that they know that we're coming to a close. We're wrapping it up with a bow. Next up was the speech structure, and speeches can be timed in lots of different orders. They can be in sequence of time. They can be spatial, so you could talk about a local issue, a national issue, and then global implications. So you're going outwards. It could be a triplet, like here's a problem, here's a solution, and here's the action you need to take. By picking a logical order, People will understand the speech. The second thing in that module is how do you transition from one topic to the next so your audience doesn't fall off somewhere along the journey. Finally is effective writing, and there are lots of techniques for effective writing. Having a great description, a visual description of something that happened, or that really appeals to the senses, can transport your audience somewhere. Using poetic devices like similes and metaphors or analogies or repetition are really effective. And as someone pointed out in the chat, adding humor will open people up to new perspectives and make the speech more enjoyable and more memorable. Today, we're going to move on to the last module. Don't give up. I believe in you all. A person's a person, no matter how small. Can anyone tell me who said that? And you can throw it in the chat. Well, Dr. Seuss said it, but that's not who the character was. Does anybody recognize the character? But thank you, Lydia. The character is actually Horton. And it's from the story Horton the Elephant. Horton Hears a Who. And Horton is the elephant on the front cover. This is a rare photo. That's Dr. Seuss. He never had any children and never wanted them. But this is a rare photo of him reading one of his stories to a child. Dr. Seuss was quoted as saying, "You have him, I'll entertain him." He wanted no part of children. But what's interesting is the things that we remember as children are often stories. And it's really quite universal. So today's module, we're going to talk about the power of storytelling. I'm hoping by the end of this, you'll be able to describe the value of storytelling, collect and curate some of your stories. And really, I think your stories are who you are. And I'm going to give you some storytelling techniques that you can include. And as well, I'll make sure that I send out the PowerPoint deck because there are a couple of links to get more information. It's a very deep, deep subject. Now, if I go back to my story, when I rejoined Toastmasters, I didn't really know what I didn't know. I thought I was coming back to do organization and present facts. And what I discovered is what I really needed to learn. I had to learn to connect with people because until you connect with them, they probably don't really listen deeply to your speech. And building that connection, one of the best ways to do that is through stories. And that was one of my bigger lessons with Toastmasters. Once they connect with you on a personal level, that's when they open up to listening to your message. And that's where storytelling becomes so powerful. So we talk about a speech being more than a series of facts. I'm going to go back to the chat because earlier I presented you a set of facts, and I'd like anyone who can tell me very quickly the answers to all of these questions, because I told you that these were facts. I told you they were important. I told you they were true. And I told you I wanted you to remember them. So pop quiz, who can name all of these? Who can assign the numbers with the action they took? I kind of have to say I'm a little disappointed because I did say I wanted you to remember, and I said they were important, but maybe they weren't all that memorable. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you another chance, but I'm going to make it a little bit harder. I'm going to change the name, but I'm just going to leave the first letter of the name. And then I'd like everyone to come off mute right now. And I'd like you to shout out with a different name, same first letter. Who can tell me who brought the eggs?
Dora.
Who?
We now, oh, I see. Dora, yeah.
Right, Dora.
Dora?
Yeah.
Of the names on the right side, who brought the eggs?
Bunny.
Not
The Easter Bunny. Easter Bunny.
Easter Bunny, thank you. Who won the race?
Column.
Tortoise.
Pardon me?
Tortoise.
Tortoise won the race. Who gave the speech?
Martin Luther King.
Yes. He gave a few great speeches. Who threw the rock?
David and Goliath.
And he threw it at Goliath. I didn't even tell you Goliath was in the story, but you got it anyway. Who rang the bell?
Quasimodo.
Yes. Who lost the ring?
Golem.
My precious. Who saved the day?
Rudolph.
Rudolph
Sydney.
saved the day. Who scored the goal?
Sydney.
Sydney. Most of us remember where we were when Sydney scored the goal. Who changed the approach?
Picasso.
Picasso. And who sat under the tree?
Newton.
That last one was kind of easy.
But the apple fell on his head.
That's true, it did. And so here's the thing. Something I told you 5 minutes ago, you couldn't remember any of it. But stories that you've been told, whether they're childhood stories or part of our culture or things that really inspire us, we remember those years later because we remember the story that goes along with it. And this is why stories become so memorable in a speech. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of storytelling, because it turns out that early humans who lived in caves did not evolve using PowerPoint to communicate with each other over Zoom. They told stories, didn't they? Early cave art tells of the story of the Great Hunt. The Greeks had their myths, so did the Romans, and the indigenous people had their oral histories. These stories and myths explain how the world was created, how we got here. They reflect the culture, the morality of right and wrong, and the worldview of how those societies should live. Now, a couple of things that happen. When we hear stories, our brains start to release oxytocin, sorry. And this promotes trust in the speaker. It makes us more willing to engage and listen and collaborate, because that's part of what builds that connection between the speaker and the audience. It's the same effect that early humans had when they met a stranger. They had to make a quick decision about whether this was a friend or foe. Neuroscience also find that when we hear stories, not only do we produce oxytocin, but that also enhances our memory. So not only will your audience connect with you and trust you, they're more likely to remember what you said. A good story can take your audience to a place where they can see or feel or experience what the characters saw or felt or experienced. They can imagine their bodies doing what the characters in the story were doing. And that arouses more parts of the brain and deepens the connection. It also increases the memory. And I remember when my eldest son was very, very young, he was probably about 2, and he had this favorite story, The Little Red Caboose. We had a bookshelf in our living room, and the bottom bookshelf was the one that he could reach, and all of his storybooks were on that. And I remember coming down the stairs around the corner, and he had pulled out The Little Red Caboose, and he turned to the first page. And he said, "The little red caboose always came last." He turned the page. First came the big black engine, puffing and chuffing. Turned the page. Then came the box cars. Turned the page. Then the oil cars. Turned the page. Then the coal cars. Turned the page. Then the flat cars. He had memorized the story and what words went with what pages. It looked just like he was reading the story, but in fact, he remembered it. He knew it by heart because I had read that story to him 47,000 times. We always let our kids choose their books that we read to them at night, and they wanted us to read them again and again. My theory was that as young children, as they're trying to figure out how the world works, they're constructing that world through stories. And they hear the story, they experience the world, and then they're interpreting and building, and they want to hear the story again to check their structure. Now, storytelling is certainly an art, but there are patterns that exist. And one of the really nice patterns that I've seen is called the story scaffold. And if you go to the blog below, you will see more information on this one. And I encourage you to do that afterwards. It's the pattern that is used by Pixar. And I know that Lydia has a Pixar virtual background today from the movie Monsters, Inc. Pixar, if you look at their movies, they are great storytellers. The first thing in a lot of their stories is the context. This is your once upon a time. It gives a little bit of background about the protagonist who is, or the main character. In a speech, you have to be really quick about the background. You can't, if you've got 5 to 7 minutes, you really want to cut to the chase fairly quickly. So sift through your backstory and tell people just what they need to know to pull off the story. The next thing is the catalyst. This is your, everything is fine until one day something happened. And this is a something happened. There's a change in the protagonist's world. It can be good or bad, as long as it represents something significant. In your speech, this is the first point where you create a little bit of tension. One of the really effective tools is not only talk about the event, but talk about the emotional reaction of your protagonist, because that's what pulls people in. If people can start relating to your protagonist, you've really got them hooked. Next up, we've got the complication. And this is, once you've got the catalyst, something has changed, it has an impact on your protagonist or your heroine. Typically, that creates a choice. Your protagonist can do this or they can do that. How are they going to react? Here you can develop lots of, this is great fodder for a story with a moral. The protagonist can either do the right thing or the wrong thing, or they can do the wrong thing and then come back and figure out what the right thing is. But you can explore the protagonist's values. Next up, there is a change. So once the protagonist or the heroine decides on a path to overcome whatever this complication is, they have to do something. And herein, you might come up with a couple of twists and turns, and maybe there's a series of choices. They do the wrong thing, they learn, and they come back and succeed. If you look at, for example, the Rocky movies, the first Rocky movie, he loses. In the second one, he comes back, he's learned, he's changed. Finally, you have the consequence. based on the actions taken, there's some kind of an outcome to the story. And again, here, you can explore the protagonist's emotional reaction. And if your audience is relating to them, then it's a really great way to share or persuade, to say, here's what has happened. I heard a great story this morning at Just Pros Toastmasters. It was given by someone whose husband was in a bicycle accident. So she told us a little bit about her life before. He had this accident. He had a serious concussion and a brain injury, and their life significantly changed. And she told us about the transformation in life, what has changed. For example, now when they go out, she has to do all the driving because he's still not able to drive. And that's one of the consequences. But the other thing, and it was called Lemonade from Lemons. And what the consequence, aside from the negative result of the accident, was she said that they've come much closer together because she experienced the potential of loss of her husband. And they started realizing how important one another were to them. And so that was the lemonade that came out of it. It was a compelling story, and we were all hooked throughout. So I'm going to give you some really good advertising, because good advertising tells a story. Okay, Ray's going to share a screen. It's only a 3.5-minute video, but think of it, it is an ad for a product.
ये मैं, ये यूसुफ, लंगोटिया यार सी मेरा। लाहौर में हमारे घर के सामने एक बड़ा बाग था। उस बाग का गेट बाबा आदम के ज़माने। रोज शाम को हमने वहाँ पतंगे उड़ानी, और उसके बाद जाके यूसुफ के दुकान से झझरिया चुरा के खानी।
झझरिया?
मेरा साहब नमस्ते। नमस्ते। मेरी पोती मुंबई वाली। और बेटे क्या हाल है?
बचपन की तंग गली फिर से कूदे फांदे, छोटी छोटी मीठी चोरी गांठ लेके बांधे।
हेलो अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
फाजिल स्वीट्स?
हाँ जी। दादाजान, दिल्ली से किसी की कॉल है।
हेलो,
यूसुफ अंकल?
कौन?
जी मैं सुमन बोल रही हूँ दिल्ली से, आपके बचपन के दोस्त बलदेव जी की पोती। याद है बचपन में आप दोनों झझरिया चुरा के खाते थे?
बचपन की तंग गली फिर से कूदे फांदे, छोटी छोटी मीठी चोरी गांठ लेके बांधे। एक पतंग सा उड़ता था परिंदों की तरह, परिंदों की तरह, परिंदों की तरह। एक दौर था मन मन मोर था, एक दौर था मन मन मोर था।
पार्टीशन के वक्त हम रातों रात हिंदुस्तान आ गए।
दादू?
यूसुफ दी बड़ी याद आती है।
कागजों की कश्तियों में डूबा रहता था, झांकती खिड़कियों में उलझा रहता था। वो भी क्या दौर था, मन पे न जोर था। एक दौर था मन मन मोर था, एक दौर था मन मन मोर था।
भैया थोड़ा जल्दी।
हाँ जी कौन हैप्पी बर्थडे यारा यूसुफ यूसुफ ओए यूसुफ मेरे बल्लू ओए यूसुफ यार
So let's go over to the chat. First off, who needs a Kleenex at this point? What I'd like you to think about is how many different Google requests, because that was an ad for Google, how many different Google requests were made through the course of 3.5 minutes? Were you counting them? Did you notice? Ray's not counting. Lydia said 5 or 6.
I'd say about 10.
Okay, it was 7 of them. The other thing is, do you have any idea what percentage of the time was showing Google things and what percentage was telling the story? %95 story, 5% Google. Actually, Lyle's got it. It's about, if you time it, it's about 20% from Google. But my reaction when I saw it was more like 5 or 10%, because what Google did, they did something really smart. They embedded their ad so cleverly into the story that it didn't take away the story. And what we followed was not, hey, here's some neat things I can do with Google. That was really incidental. It was about what's the story. And it was a universal story. It was a lovely story. There were a couple of cool things in it. Nice things, good stories sometimes leave a few things not quite spoken. I don't know if you noticed it, but the granddaughter and the grandson, they were kind of checking each other out and making eyes at each other at the end there. And it's like, well, maybe there's something coming beyond this. Who knows? But a good story doesn't necessarily tell everything. It leaves you a little bit. You can use that in your speeches because it might give you a topic for a future speech. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about different story patterns. And at the bottom of this, you don't have to memorize it all, because at the bottom of this, I've got a couple of links. And as I said, I'll share the material and you can go to the links and see them. But one common plot pattern for a story is overcoming a monster. This is where so here, your hero fights a monster, might lose, eventually wins. Common example here would be Star Wars. They use this a lot. Often happens in James Bond flicks too. Another model is rag to riches. So someone who's really lacking things finds whatever it was they wanted, whether that's wealth or something else. And Cinderella is an example of this, where, she gets the glass slippers, she becomes a princess. Voyage and return. Your main character travels to a strange place, has some experiences while trying to get home. And here you can talk about being open to new experiences or showing what you have learned. Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz are good examples of this. The Quest. This is always a great story. The Quest is really a character or a group of colleagues or friends set out to do something. They meet obstacles, they persevere. This emphasizes teamwork, overcoming obstacles for a greater goal. Lord of the Rings is a great example, or if you like funnier things, you've got Monty Python and the Holy Grail would even be an example. Aside from that, Monty Python, you usually got some comedy in it. Here, with comedy, your character faces a bunch of unfortunate circumstances and confusion. Hopefully things come together in the end. This comedies are usually lighthearted entertainment. They do often talk about how to deal with interpersonal conflict because that's often the story. Most romantic comedies in Hollywood follow this pattern. Another common pattern is a tragedy. So a character sets up to achieve some goal. Maybe it's the right goal, maybe it's not, but somehow along the way, they turn to dishonest or corrupt means. Their plan unravels and they fail or they die. And this is great for sharing a parable because the use of dishonest means doesn't take you where you want to go. So that's a common pattern. Examples here, if you've ever watched The Godfather Part 2, which is one of my favorite movies, or if you're into classical things, Macbeth is a great example of this. And rebirth. This is where someone starts off as an unpleasant character, and by the end, they are, they've redeemed themselves. This is a good way to demonstrate the impact, the power of positive choices, and emphasize a redemption. A Christmas Carol or Groundhog Day are great examples of this. So here you've got a couple of links. Lots of elements can make a story more interesting. For example, describe the setting and action. If you really give people a great description of what's happening, you can really take them there. Talk about the smells, the sights, the sounds, everything. Creating some depth in characters. Their emotional state, you can use dialogue or gestures to create more immediacy in them. You really want, very briefly, you want to give the audience those core elements that really describe the person. Another one is setting a deadline. Setting a deadline provides some urgency. So if you've got something that has to happen by a certain date, one of my, if you attended last week's session on evaluation, I showed a video, a speech by Rick Elias, who was on the airplane that landed in the Hudson River. And at some point he realized that the plane was going down on the Hudson River. There's a deadline there. There's a clear time ending. And so it creates some real urgency. Share secrets with the audience. And again, with Rick's example, we know he didn't die, but he doesn't know that yet. So it provides interest. If you have something that the audience knows that some characters don't know, it's a great way to add some intrigue. Feed some curiosity with small bites. Don't throw out all of the details. Just give it to people in small bites. And break some expectations. Include some odd circumstances that people are not expecting. For me, one of my big aha moments at Toastmasters was when I first went into a Tall Tales contest, because it was first time I got out of the facts and interesting ideas mode, and I was forced to tell a ridiculous story. That gave me a new range. It was something that I hadn't done before, and it allowed me to stretch. And that's where I really started coming out of my standard approach to speaking. And that's where I started realizing things like connecting with the audience is really, really important. Now, I'll give you a few advanced storytelling techniques. These are also available on the at the links that are a couple of slides back. So one of them is called spark lines. This is a technique that's great for persuasive speeches. You talk about how the world is and what your hope is, and you go back and forth between how it could be and how it is, how it could be and how it is, and you can contrast back and forth. One of the examples of this is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He talks about how the world is and what his dream is, and it's a dream he wants people to achieve. Then he goes back to how it is and forward to what his hope is. So it can be really effective. In media res, you start the story partway through something. Maybe there's a startling event, and then you jump back in time and you kind of recreate how we got here. And if you think of a lot of crime dramas start, either they find a body or you witness someone dying, and then the detective's job is to go back in time and recreate the set of events that led up to that so that you get a resolution. A pretty advanced technique is nested loops. That's where you start a story, and then as part of the story, you break into another story. And sometimes you can break into yet another story. Then you close story number 3, and that provides something to take you back to story number 2, and that brings you back to story number 1. Couple of examples. If you ever read Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad's story, my favorite is, if you've ever seen the movie The Man Who Would Be King, it was in the mid-70s. One of my favorite movies. It had Michael Caine and Sean Connery. It was based on a Rudyard Kipling book. And at the beginning of the story, an old grizzled Michael Caine comes in to see, I think he's an accountant, and says, do you remember me? And the guy can't remember him initially, but he starts talking about, well, I came here with my colleague a few years earlier. And then the guy remembers, and he tells the story of how Michael Caine's character and Sean Connery's character impersonated kings in a remote area of Asia. And he goes through this story. It's really effective there. The pedal structure. In this model, you've got a number of different stories looking at different aspects of whatever it is your theme is. And you can put together 2 or 3 or 4. Each one needs to relate to the main theme, and you need to transition nicely between them. If you've ever seen Muhammad Khatani's 2015 World Championship speech, The Power of Words, he tells a number of stories about the power of words, and he ties them all together, but each story is unique. So he's following this one. Another one, you can distribute a story throughout your speech. So you can talk about whatever you're talking about today. You begin a story, and then you tell little pieces of the story throughout. All right, our last little chat time. We're not done yet, but before we get too far down, I just wanted to see if people can say in the chat, what are 1 or 2 things that you'll take away from what you've seen so far today? The obstacle is the way, Marcus Aurelius and later Nietzsche. Okay. And yes, it will all be posted. Add a story for our audience to engage and remember. Yes, it does 2 great things. It engages people and it helps them remember. I kind of think of facts are not so interesting in and of themselves. If you want people to remember them, if you can tie them to something that seems important. And Lydia says, people remember a story better. It's true. They really, really do. Organization of key structures to concentrate upon. And I'll reiterate, go to the websites I've got there and you can read more. I don't have time to go through them in detail. Great formats, thoughts on how a story can be enhanced. Yeah, there are lots of different things. And remember, in a 5 to 7 minute speech, you've got very little time, so you have to bring in just the right things. Ray, stories anchor facts. Yes, absolutely. I almost think of a story as like if you're trying to appreciate art, the museum or the art gallery is just holding the art. There's a whole lot of context. The art is what you go see. It's kind of like you want to present some facts, but you've got to provide the backdrop for all of that. Presentation options, excellent. And yeah, one thing you can start noticing stories, and that'll give you some background, and it'll help you understand the patterns, and you'll start seeing patterns in stories, and then you'll be able to start applying them in your stories. So the next thing I said very early on, our stories are really who we are. So what I'd like you to think about is building your catalog of stories. You can use pen and paper like the photo here, but start recording snippets or impressions or little funny observations that you make. Write them down somewhere. You can organize them over time. Just have a place to capture them and worry about organization later. You can do it journal. I use an electronic version of a journal just because I've usually got a computer around me somewhere. But over the years, I've continued to kind of expand my use of stories, not because I'm supposed to, but I eventually started realizing that that's the best way to bring my audience or bring my message to the audience. Data and facts and ideas may be what you want people to take away, but they can appear kind of empty, like who brought the eggs? As there's a storyteller named Lewis Richardson, and he was quoted as saying, data without a story is like a palette without a painting. The stories take the data and facts and ideas and they bring them to life. So if you want to bring your speeches to life and bring your ideas to life, bring them in a story. A few closing thoughts. Be early and bound it mostly. And by that, I mean, start the story early, get your audience engaged, and close off the story mostly. Sometimes you can leave a couple of little open threads to keep people interested and keep people thinking, kind of like the granddaughter and grandson in the Google story. Be authentic. If it's really your story, it will be much more engaging. And be open, show some real emotion, because that's going to build up not only the story, but it's going to build the trust, and people are going to get to know you, and they're going to remember your story. Be brief. The story I heard at Just Prose this morning was a 30-minute speech, so the speaker had time to develop it. Most speeches are 7 minutes long. You have to be really concise, get some characters, get some emotional change, and some visual details. Be clear, particularly in a 7-minute speech. Everything in the story needs to be part of what you're sharing in the story, and the story has to relate to your speech purpose. So make it as easy as possible for people to understand it, so they don't have to work through details to decode them. If the details aren't important, throw them out. And again, as I said, be purposeful. Don't tell a great story unless it directly relates to your speech purpose. And if it doesn't, well, then that story can be the basis of your next speech. So in closing, I'd like to you each to reflect on how you can deliver or describe the value of storytelling in a speech. Collect and curate some of your stories. They are who you are, and I hope you'll start writing some of those down and apply storytelling techniques and include them in your speeches. For me, one of the biggest things I learned out of Toastmasters came from my District 96 context speech. And I still have so much to learn, but that was really a watershed moment. What I learned was the importance of feedback, and I can point to 6 specific people who evaluated my speech and offered me feedback that had led to a very specific change in the speech. Andrew Thompson, who's a former district champion, he was the one who suggested that I bring in Scooby-Doo. Initially, it was just a cartoon character, and that brought it out. Nayla Scott made me add the story of my father. Denise Wozniak taught me about using the stage. Lily Laverton talked about the confusion when I went off screen. So when I changed it so that when I went off screen, the first thing I said was, "Where did you go?" So that people knew that it was intentional. And at Blue Heron, Gene Vickers, and from Top Story, Vivian Ip, or from Just Prose, Vivian Ip, also brought in elements to my speech. So although the trophy carries my name, what I learned is that nothing we do is done alone. And the stories we tell and the stories we live, that's who we are. And that has been my growth experience in Toastmasters. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for watching this video on the Toastmasters District 96 YouTube channel. Subscribe to our channel to watch replays of our volunteer-run workshops, contests, and other events that are happening in our district. Like this video to show your appreciation for the volunteers who work hard to run these events. And remember, we are all volunteers. Thank you.